The night was calm, the street lights glowed faintly, and the hum of cars passing by filled the air. She was driving home after a long meeting, her thoughts still on the files waiting at her desk. Dressed in plain clothes, she looked like any other working woman returning from a busy day. To her, it was just another ordinary drive, but in a matter of minutes, her life would be pulled into a storm that would test her patience, her courage, and her sense of justice. A pair of flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared in her rearview mirror. She slowed down, signaled, and gently pulled her car to the side of the road. Her hands stayed calmly on the wheel, as she had always been taught, because she understood better than most how important it was to show no sudden movements. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was likely a routine stop. Two police officers stepped out of their car, their flashlights cutting through the night as they approached. The taller one knocked on her window with a brisk tap. She rolled it down halfway and greeted them politely. Her voice was soft, respectful, but steady. The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked her over, his flashlight moving across her face, then the car interior. "License and registration," he said, his tone sharp. She nodded, moved slowly, and handed them over. She expected the stop to be over quickly once they saw everything was in order. But instead of returning to his car, the officer stared at her as though something about her presence unsettled him. His partner shifted impatiently beside him, whispering something she couldn't hear. The seconds stretched into uncomfortable silence. Finally, the taller officer asked her to step out of the car. She blinked, surprised, but kept her voice even. "Officer, may I ask the reason?" she said. Her words were calm, her tone not confrontational, only seeking clarity. The officer's eyes narrowed further. "You're resisting," he snapped. She froze, stunned at the accusation. She had asked a question, nothing more. But before she could answer, both officers moved closer. Her instincts told her to comply, to avoid escalating the situation. She unbuckled her seat belt, opened the door slowly, and stepped onto the pavement. The air outside was cooler, sharper, and the world suddenly felt heavier. The second officer grabbed her arm firmly, pulling her away from the car. She didn't resist, didn't fight back, only moved as directed. Yet his grip tightened, as though he expected her to break free at any moment. The taller one circled around her, his voice rising. "Stop resisting," he repeated, though she hadn't resisted at all. The words stung because she knew what they really meant. He was painting a picture that wasn't true. She tried to speak, her voice gentle. "I'm not resisting, sir. I'm cooperating fully." But her calm words were met with suspicion. The grip on her arm became harsher, and the taller officer pressed closer, his presence overwhelming. She felt a hand push against her back, forcing her forward. The officers' voices were louder now, echoing off the quiet street. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a dangerous suspect was being controlled. But in reality, it was a woman standing quietly, caught in the storm of assumptions. Her heart beat faster, not from fear of what she had done because she had done nothing, but from fear of what they might do next. She had trained for moments like this in her career, studied countless cases, seen how quickly situations could spiral. But experiencing it herself was different. Her knowledge did not shield her from the sting of being misjudged. The taller officer pushed her toward the police car, insisting again that she was resisting. She tried to remind herself to stay calm, to not let frustration show, because she knew that in situations like this, emotion could be twisted against her. The irony struck her deeply. Here she was, a woman who had dedicated her life to law, to justice, and she was being treated as though she were the enemy of it all. She thought of her family for a brief moment, of the sacrifices she had made to reach where she was. She thought of the oath she had taken to uphold fairness and protect citizens. And here she was, on the other side, not as the protector, but as the accused. A quiet ache rose in her chest, but she swallowed it down. As one officer held her arm, the other moved to restrain her further. She did not pull away, did not fight back, yet they acted as though she had. She knew that arguing, shouting, or demanding recognition of her true identity would only worsen matters here. This was not the place to reveal who she really was. So she endured the rough treatment, her dignity intact, though her heart carried the weight of injustice. Cars passed by occasionally, their drivers slowing down to glance at the scene. To them, it may have looked like an arrest in progress. None of them knew that the woman being handled so harshly was someone who had dedicated her life to upholding the very law now being turned against her. The night air carried the sound of her steady breathing, the rough voices of the officers, and the distant hum of traffic. Inside, she fought to keep her composure, to remind herself that her worth was not defined by this moment. She thought of the many people who had stood in her place before, ordinary citizens, without the power or platform she held, people whose voices had been lost in the noise of misunderstanding. She felt connected to them now, not as a leader or authority, but as one of them, facing the same trial of judgment. When the officers finally shoved her into the back seat of their car, the door slammed with a hollow thud that seemed to seal her into a world of silence. She sat there, her hands trembling slightly though her face remained calm. The world outside blurred through the window, the lights stretching like streaks of memory. She whispered to herself, a silent promise, that this moment would not break her. It would only remind her why she had chosen her path in life. And so the night continued, not as an ordinary drive home, but as the beginning of a story that would soon shake not just her life, but the lives of everyone who believed that justice must be blind and fair. For now, though, she remained in the back of that car, carrying the weight of her truth, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would finally be revealed. The ride to the station felt longer than it really was. The car was moving through familiar streets, yet everything seemed distant, blurred by the heaviness of the moment. She sat in the back seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the window. The officers in the front whispered to each other, their voices low, their words sharp. She caught pieces of what they said, enough to know they were building a story about her before even knowing who she was. When the car stopped, the taller officer opened the door and motioned for her to step out. She obeyed without hesitation, her calmness almost unsettling in the face of their roughness. Inside, the station smelled of stale coffee, paperwork, and tiredness. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, casting a pale glow on the room. A few officers looked up from their desks, curious about the scene unfolding before them. To them, she was just another person brought in for resisting. They guided her to a chair and began asking questions. Their voices were firm, their expressions stern, but underneath, there was also a trace of arrogance, as though they had already judged her without hearing her side. She answered politely, keeping her tone measured, never raising her voice. Her calmness made them uneasy. They expected fear, anger, or excuses. What they found instead was grace. She remembered her journey, the long path that had brought her to this point in life. Born into a modest home, raised with values of hard work and respect, she had always believed in education as her way forward. Her mother worked 2 jobs, her father taught her discipline, and together they planted in her the seed of determination. Even as a child, she had known that life would not hand her anything easily. She would have to earn it. And she did. She studied late into the night, read books that opened her mind, and chased opportunities that many believed were out of her reach. She was not content with being ordinary, she wanted to make a difference. She wanted to protect, to serve, to uphold what was right. While other children dreamed of fame or fortune, she dreamed of justice. Her first step into law enforcement had been humble. A trainee, learning the ropes, often underestimated, often doubted. But she never let doubt break her spirit. She watched, listened, and absorbed everything around her. She learned how to read people, how to see beyond words, how to sense truth hidden beneath fear. Slowly, she rose through the ranks, each promotion not a gift but a recognition of relentless effort. She faced struggles too. Many times, she had walked into rooms where she was the only woman. Even more often, the only black woman. People questioned her, not because of her skills, but because of their assumptions. She had learned to let her work answer for her. She never fought back with anger, she fought with results. And results spoke louder than any prejudice. Years passed, and her reputation grew. She became known for her fairness, her intelligence, and her courage. When difficult cases landed on her desk, she never looked for the easy way out. She searched for the truth, no matter how long it took. She built trust among colleagues, and even those who doubted her once began to respect her. Step by step, she climbed to the highest level, until one day, she was chosen as the director of the FBI. It was a moment of pride, not just for her but for everyone who had ever believed that dedication could overcome obstacles. She had broken barriers many thought unbreakable. And yet, here she was, sitting in a small station, being accused of resisting when all she had done was ask a question. The irony cut deep. Back in the station, the officers continued their questioning. They spoke to her as if she were guilty, as if she were less. She listened quietly, her mind calm but her heart heavy. She thought of the countless ordinary people who sat in that same chair, facing the same treatment, but without the shield of status or recognition. She realized then that her experience, painful as it was, connected her more closely to them than ever before. One officer leaned closer, demanding answers she had already given. His tone was sharp, his eyes filled with suspicion. She met his gaze steadily, not with anger, but with quiet strength. The more he pressed, the more her silence spoke. He could not shake her composure, no matter how hard he tried. In that moment, she felt a quiet power inside her. Not the power of her title, not the authority of her office, but the power of truth. She knew who she was. Nothing they said, nothing they did, could take that away. As the hours passed, she found herself drifting back to memories of her early career. She remembered the nights she stayed at her desk long after everyone else had gone home, poring over files. She remembered the families who had thanked her for bringing justice to their loved ones. She remembered the promises she had made to herself, that she would never allow power to make her forget compassion, that she would always stand for those who had no voice. She thought of her mentors, the people who had believed in her when others did not. Their encouragement had fueled her drive. She thought of her family, the sacrifices they had made so she could pursue her dreams. She thought of the oath she had taken, the weight of responsibility she carried every day as director. And she knew, sitting in that small station, that none of it would be wasted. The officers may not have known her identity, but that did not matter. What mattered was the lesson that was forming in this moment, a reminder that titles and positions mean nothing when bias clouds judgment. What she faced tonight was not just her struggle, it was the reflection of a larger struggle faced by many. She sat there, quietly strong, while the officers prepared more paperwork. They thought they had subdued her, but in reality, they had awakened something greater. For her, this was not just an incident. It was a story that would carry meaning far beyond these walls. And though the night seemed heavy, she knew the dawn would come. Truth always found its way, even through the darkest shadows. She closed her eyes briefly, whispering in her heart a promise, that she would use this moment, painful as it was, to fuel the change she had always believed in. The room buzzed with activity, the officers unaware of the history sitting right in front of them. They saw only what their eyes allowed, but soon, the world would see what they had missed. For now, she waited, patient as ever, carrying within her the strength of her journey, the pride of her path, and the unshakable truth of who she was. The hours inside the station stretched like an endless rope, pulling tighter with each passing minute. She sat quietly, her back straight, her eyes steady, while the officers moved around her with growing impatience. They had written their reports, filled out their notes, and yet something about her calm silence unsettled them. She did not protest, she did not shout, she did not argue. She simply existed with a dignity that none of their actions could erase. One officer leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table. "Who do you think you are?" he asked, his voice sharp, almost mocking. She lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes with the quiet strength that came not from defiance but from truth. "I am exactly who I need to be," she replied softly. The officer frowned, confused by her answer. The taller one, the same who had pulled her from her car, crossed his arms and shook his head. "You act like you're above the law," he muttered. His words lingered in the air, heavy with irony. She had spent her entire life serving the law, defending it, shaping it. Yet here, in this small room, she was being accused of disrespecting it. She did not respond this time. Her silence was not weakness, it was her shield. She knew the moment for truth would come, and when it did, no argument, no false report, no assumption could stand against it. At last, after hours of waiting, the officers decided to take her information properly. They asked for identification again, perhaps expecting her to hesitate, to stumble, to reveal a story they could twist. Instead, she reached into her bag slowly, carefully, and pulled out her wallet. She placed her official identification card on the table, sliding it toward them with deliberate calm. The room seemed to freeze. The officer closest to her glanced at the card, his eyes skimming the surface lazily at first, then pausing. His expression shifted from annoyance to confusion, and then to something closer to disbelief. He leaned forward, reading the name again, the title printed clearly beneath it, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the card. His partner noticed the change in his face and snatched the card from him, as if convinced there had been some mistake. He read it himself, and his confident smirk dissolved into silence. The card did not lie. The woman they had accused of resisting, the woman they had treated with such disregard, was not just any citizen. She was the leader of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the nation. The taller officer's throat went dry. He looked at her again, but now he no longer saw just a woman in plain clothes. He saw the director. The weight of his actions crashed down on him all at once, and for the first time that night, he was the one who felt powerless. A heavy silence filled the room. The officers glanced at each other nervously, unsure what to say, unsure how to undo what had been done. She remained calm, her hands folded, her face unreadable. She did not gloat, she did not raise her voice, she did not need to. Her presence alone carried the truth louder than any words. Finally, one of them stammered, "Ma'am, we didn't know." Her gaze was steady, unflinching. "And that," she said quietly, "is exactly the problem." The words cut deeper than any reprimand. They were not spoken with anger, but with truth, a truth that revealed the flaw at the heart of what had just happened. They had not judged her by her actions, by her words, or by her behavior. They had judged her by what they assumed. And that assumption had led them to treat her with the very injustice she had spent her life fighting against. The officers tried to apologize, their voices tripping over each other, their words desperate to erase the memory of what they had done. But she remained silent. She had no interest in their excuses. What had happened was not about her title. It was about something far bigger, something that stretched beyond this room, beyond this night. Another officer, older and wiser, entered the room at that moment. He looked at the scene, noticed the card on the table, and instantly understood. His face paled, and he nodded respectfully toward her. Unlike the others, he did not scramble to explain. He knew that explanations were useless. Instead, he simply bowed his head and whispered, "Director." The title hung in the air, reminding everyone present of the gravity of the situation. The younger officers' faces turned red with shame. They realized that their actions, once hidden in the safety of the night, would now come into the light. She rose from her chair slowly, her movements graceful, controlled. She picked up her identification card and slid it back into her wallet. Her eyes swept across the room, not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. Disappointment that echoed louder than shouting ever could. The taller officer opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came. His earlier confidence, his arrogance, had vanished completely. He knew that this moment would not be forgotten. Not by her, not by him, and soon, not by anyone else. She walked toward the door, her steps measured, her presence commanding. The room seemed to part around her, the officers stepping back as though unsure whether to stop her or to escort her. She did not need either. Her authority was not in question anymore. Before she left, she paused and turned back to them. Her voice was calm, steady, almost gentle, but carrying the weight of unshakable truth. The law is meant to protect, not to harm. Remember that the next time you choose how to act. Then she stepped out into the hallway, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside the station, the night air greeted her again, cool and refreshing. She inhaled deeply, feeling both the sting of what had happened and the strength of having endured it. She knew this was not the end of the story. This was only the beginning. The revelation of her identity was not just a shock to those officers. It was a mirror, reflecting a truth that society often ignored, that bias and assumption could blind even those sworn to uphold justice. She knew that when the world learned of what had happened, the conversation would spread far beyond these walls. But for now, she simply stood under the quiet sky, steady and calm, knowing that her truth had been revealed, and with it, a new chapter was about to unfold. News travels fast, but this time it seemed to move even faster. By morning, the story had spread through every channel, every station, and every device that could carry a message. Social media erupted with reactions, some expressing shock, others anger, and many more simply trying to process what had happened. People watched the video of the arrest, replayed it over and over, and finally learned the truth. The woman being choked, handcuffed, and accused of resisting was the director of the FBI. The scene was everywhere. Screens in homes, offices, and even public spaces displayed her calm face as she had been treated unfairly. The words beneath the images told the story plainly: cops detain FBI director for resisting arrest unaware of her identity. People could not believe it. How could this happen? How could officers, trained to understand the law, make such a mistake? The questions swirled, and the answers were nowhere easy to find. In the newsroom, journalists scrambled. Phones rang off the hook, emails stacked up, and editors barked orders. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, a quote, an explanation, a reaction. The public wanted transparency, and they wanted accountability. The woman at the center of it, however, did not seek the spotlight. She had no desire for headlines, no need for recognition. She sought only to ensure that the truth, and the principles she had always stood for, were acknowledged. Meanwhile, inside government offices, meetings were convened in record time. Senior officials gathered to discuss the incident. Some were in disbelief, others in embarrassment, and a few in quiet admiration. They understood the gravity of the situation not just because it involved the director herself, but because it reflected on the institutions they served. If the law could fail someone like her, how many others had suffered quietly, unseen, and unheard? Across the country, citizens watched the story unfold and reacted with a mixture of emotions. Many were outraged, feeling that this was a clear example of injustice in its most raw form. Others felt relieved that the truth had been revealed, that someone powerful, someone in charge of law enforcement at the highest level, had experienced firsthand the dangers of assumptions and bias. Discussions spread from living rooms to workplaces, from classrooms to coffee shops. People debated what had gone wrong, why it had gone wrong, and how to prevent it from happening again. The officers involved were placed on leave almost immediately. It was a standard procedure, but the public scrutiny turned it into something far larger. People demanded more than protocol, they demanded accountability. Investigations were launched, internal reviews began, and lawyers prepared for the formal processes that would follow. Yet, amid the tension and pressure, one truth remained simple and undeniable: a mistake had been made, one that had shaken the faith of those who watched, and one that had sent ripples through an entire nation. The director herself stayed focused. She continued her work, addressing reports, attending meetings, and guiding operations. But the event lingered in her mind. She thought about the people who faced prejudice every day, those who were not shielded by power or title. She thought about the fear, the misunderstanding, and the frustration that must have built up in the hearts of countless individuals who had no platform, no recognition, no way to defend themselves. Her experience had been personal, yes, but it was also symbolic. It reminded her that her responsibility extended far beyond her office, beyond policy and procedure, and deep into the lives of every citizen she had sworn to protect. At press conferences, reporters pressed her for statements, but she responded with measured words. She focused not on anger, not on revenge, but on reflection. She spoke of accountability, fairness, and the importance of training officers to approach every situation without bias. Her words carried weight because she had lived the experience. She did not need to dramatize, her calm authority spoke louder than any dramatic recounting ever could. Social media continued to buzz. Memes and commentary exploded, some humorous, others serious. The world debated whether this incident would change policies, whether it would spark reforms, whether the training and understanding of law enforcement officers could evolve in a meaningful way. Every post, every story, every video replayed the moment when authority met humility, when power faced reality, and when a simple assumption turned into a national lesson. Despite the public attention, the director focused on the lessons, not the spectacle. She visited training facilities, meeting with officers across different states. She emphasized empathy, awareness, and understanding. She shared her story without anger, without blame, illustrating the human side of law enforcement, the delicate balance between authority and responsibility. Officers listened, some with discomfort, others with deep reflection. For many, it was an eye-opening experience, realizing that even those who enforce the law can be mistaken, and that humility must always accompany authority. In communities, conversations blossomed. Citizens and leaders gathered to discuss fairness, to explore ways to prevent such incidents, and to educate future generations. Schools held discussions on civics and justice, highlighting the importance of knowing the law and respecting every individual, regardless of their position or status. People began to see that the story was more than an isolated event, it was a lesson about society, bias, and responsibility. At the same time, the officers involved faced a complex mix of emotions. They experienced regret, embarrassment, and fear of repercussions. Some struggled with understanding how a simple mistake could escalate into such a public and far-reaching issue. Counseling and guidance were offered, and through reflection, many began to grasp the depth of their actions. They had learned a hard lesson, one that would shape their careers and their perspectives forever. Meanwhile, the director quietly acknowledged the support she received from colleagues, friends, and the public. Messages of encouragement poured in from all corners, reminding her that the story resonated not because of her title, but because it reflected a truth many recognized: mistakes happen, assumptions harm, and fairness is the responsibility of every person in power. As days turned into weeks, the incident became a case study. Universities, law enforcement academies, and professional organizations analyzed it, discussing it in classrooms and training sessions. Articles were written, lectures were delivered, and debates were held. It was no longer just a story of one night, it had become a teaching moment, a catalyst for reflection, and a guide for better practices in the future. Through all of this, the director remained composed. She continued her work, mindful of the lessons learned and committed to ensuring that her experience would benefit others. She met with lawmakers to discuss policy improvements, encouraged training programs that emphasized empathy and awareness, and reinforced the principle that the law should serve all people equally. But perhaps the most profound impact was subtle, personal, and immeasurable. For those who had witnessed the incident, whether on screen or in conversation, the lesson sank in deeply. People began to question assumptions in their own lives, to recognize the power of bias, and to consider the human side of every interaction. What had begun as a shocking event became a moment of growth, reflection, and understanding for countless individuals. And yet, even as the world watched, life moved on. The director continued her daily routines, attending meetings, reviewing cases, and making decisions that affected the lives of millions. But behind the professionalism and dedication, she carried a quiet strength, born not only from the responsibilities of her position but from the experience that reminded her and everyone else that authority without empathy can falter, but truth, integrity, and patience always endure. Time has a way of moving forward, but some events leave a permanent mark, not only on those directly involved but on everyone who witnesses the ripple effects. For the director of the FBI, the incident that had shocked the nation remained vivid in her mind, but it had also become a source of clarity. She understood, more than ever, the weight of responsibility not just as a leader, but as a human being entrusted with the safety, fairness, and trust of the people she served. After weeks of investigations, discussions, and public discourse, the findings were finally announced. The internal review concluded that the officers had acted without full knowledge of the situation. It was clear that assumptions had guided their actions rather than careful observation and communication. There was no malicious intent, yet the consequences had been profound. Accountability measures were taken not as punishment, but as a way to ensure lessons were learned, and systems were improved. The officers received additional training, guidance, and mentorship to help them understand the importance of awareness, empathy, and caution in their roles. The director herself was part of the discussions that shaped these new procedures. Her perspective was invaluable. She emphasized that mistakes could happen to anyone, even to those who enforce the law, and that acknowledging errors, learning from them, and preventing recurrence were what mattered most. She worked closely with training coordinators to implement programs that emphasized real-world scenarios, decision-making under pressure, and the human element behind every action. These programs aimed to create officers who were not only skilled and efficient but also wise, compassionate, and alert to the nuances of every situation. Meanwhile, the public remained engaged. The conversation did not end when the headlines faded. Schools used the incident as a case study in civics classes, exploring themes of justice, authority, and responsibility. Community organizations hosted forums where citizens could discuss their own experiences, fears, and hopes for a fairer society. Families talked openly about assumptions, respect, and the importance of seeing people as individuals rather than stereotypes. The incident had sparked a wave of reflection that went far beyond the initial shock. It had become a teaching moment, one that reminded everyone that fairness and understanding were responsibilities shared by all. For the director, the most profound changes were not in policy or training alone, they were in relationships and perception. She found herself approached by young officers, eager to learn, curious to understand, and inspired by her composure and dedication. She met with leaders in other agencies, exchanging ideas and best practices, and forming partnerships that would strengthen institutions across the country. Even ordinary citizens reached out, sharing their gratitude, their stories, and their hopes for a future where such misunderstandings were less likely to occur. Every interaction reinforced her belief in the power of calm, thoughtful leadership and the importance of empathy in positions of authority. There were personal moments, too. The director reflected privately on how quickly assumptions can overshadow truth, and how important it is to listen, observe, and question before acting. She thought about the fear she had felt in that moment, the sudden loss of control, and the unexpected vulnerability. But she also recognized her own strength, the ability to remain calm, assert her rights respectfully, and trust that truth and integrity would prevail. It was a reminder that courage is not always loud or dramatic, sometimes it is quiet, steadfast, and composed, even in the face of misunderstanding. Media coverage continued, but the tone shifted. Stories now focused on lessons learned, reforms implemented, and the ways in which individuals and institutions had grown from the experience. Editorials praised the director's grace under pressure and highlighted the importance of systemic change. Social media, once filled with outrage, became a platform for constructive discussion. People shared resources, organized workshops, and encouraged conversations about fairness and equality. What had begun as a shocking incident had transformed into a catalyst for progress, demonstrating that even mistakes could lead to positive change when approached with honesty and reflection. The director also took the opportunity to mentor others, sharing her experience with young leaders, both in law enforcement and beyond. She emphasized the value of preparation, empathy, and humility. She reminded them that power is not simply the ability to enforce rules or make decisions, it is the responsibility to consider every person's dignity, to act with fairness, and to lead by example. Her story became a guide for aspiring leaders, a reminder that authority and humanity must always coexist. In the broader community, the impact was tangible. Law enforcement agencies reported improvements in communication, de-escalation techniques, and officer training. Citizens expressed greater confidence in reporting concerns and engaging with authorities. Schools continued to integrate discussions about justice, authority, and personal responsibility into curricula. Families, neighbors, and community leaders shared the lessons learned, helping to create environments where understanding and fairness were prioritized. The ripple effect of one incident reached far and wide, touching lives in ways that no single moment of misunderstanding could have predicted. The officers involved faced their own journey of growth. They reflected on their actions, received guidance, and learned to approach situations with greater care and attention. They came to understand that mistakes, while inevitable in life, carry responsibility and require reflection. For them, the incident was a turning point, a chance to become better, more aware, and more compassionate in their duties. They learned that respect for human dignity is not optional, it is essential, and that even experienced officers must continually refine their understanding and approach. For the director, life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, though she carried the experience with her as a quiet reminder of her purpose. She continued to lead with determination, wisdom, and integrity, always mindful that every decision, every action, and every interaction has consequences. She celebrated the progress made, but she also remained vigilant, knowing that true fairness and justice require constant effort, awareness, and commitment. In the end, the incident became more than a story, it became a symbol. It reminded everyone that authority alone does not ensure justice, that assumptions can mislead even the most trained individuals, and that courage, integrity, and reflection are essential in every human interaction. It was a story of mistakes and learning, of power and humility, and of the enduring value of treating every person with respect. And though the headlines eventually faded, the lessons remained. People remembered the image of the director, calm and composed, facing an unexpected and unfair challenge. They remembered the words of guidance she shared, the reforms that followed, and the conversations that grew from the event. They remembered that even in moments of misunderstanding, truth and integrity can shine, inspiring growth, reflection, and positive change. The director understood, better than ever, that her experience was not only personal, it was universal. It was a story about humanity, fairness, and responsibility. It was a story about how one moment, one decision, and one act of understanding could influence countless lives. And as she moved forward, continuing her work and guiding others, she carried that story with her, quietly shaping the future and leaving a legacy not just of leadership, but of justice, empathy, and unwavering integrity. In the end, the nation learned something profound. Mistakes can happen, assumptions can mislead, and authority can falter, but when confronted with truth, guided by integrity, and tempered with empathy, society can grow stronger, wiser, and fairer. The story of that night, of one woman, one misunderstanding, and the lessons it brought, would be remembered not for the fear it caused, but for the change it inspired. It was a story that would live on, reminding everyone that fairness, understanding, and humanity are not ideals to aspire to, they are responsibilities to uphold, every single day.